Thanh Trang kính chào quý vị. Hôm nay thứ Sáu ngày 29 tháng 4 2022. Kính thưa quý vị, 30 tháng 4 là một điểm mốc đánh dấu khúc ngoặt lịch sử của đất nước và cũng là điểm mốc đổi đời của tất cả những người dân miền Nam Việt Nam sống trong giai đoạn đó. Nhân dịp 30 tháng 4 2022, chúng tôi kính mời quý vị cùng theo dõi một loạt phỏng vấn đặc biệt với ông Veith, tác giả quyển Tháng Tư Đen, để tìm hiểu thêm cái nhìn của một sử gia đã bỏ ra 20 năm để viết lại câu chuyện về hai nền Cộng Hòa của miền Nam Việt Nam. Trong quyển Tuốt Kiếm Phương Xa, tác phẩm mới nhất trong 4 tác phẩm viết về cuộc chiến Việt Nam của ông, sử gia Veith đã đưa ra nhiều dữ kiện mới về kinh tế, chính trị, xã hội của miền Nam chưa từng được nhắc tới, để làm sáng tỏ những nỗ lực đấu tranh và dân chủ ở miền Nam trong 2 thập niên 60 và 70. Sau đây mời quý vị theo dõi phần 1, phỏng vấn đặc biệt với sử gia Veith do Phan Dũng thực hiện.
Phan Dũng xin kính chào quý khán thính giả. Jay, welcome.
Thank you for having me.
Okay. Bright coat, leave no man behind. Black April, drawn swords. Well, looking at all your 4 books, kind of curious, what's your thesis? Is there any relation between your PhD thesis and all these books?
So the PhD thesis grew out of drawn swords because the Black April is all about the military operations and the last 2 years of the war, whereas Drawn Swords is really more of a political, economic, social history of South Vietnam. And it became very apparent to me early on that the attempt to build democracy in South Vietnam was a key component of the South Vietnamese government. And so that's what I based my thesis on, was trying to build democracy during war. How can you do it? Can you even do it?
Okay. We Vietnamese have a saying, winners are kings and losers are pirates.
Yes, I know this, yes.
And I'm sorry to say that most of us think we were pirates. For the last 50 years, we were kind of quiet. Most Americans look at the Vietnam War, at least the Vietnam War that I knew of. All the officials corrupted. We weren't fighting the right war. We don't have the right attitude. We have no vision. And basically, we're just loser. But your book is saying something. There's something more than that.
Much different, yes. And I've tried for the last 20 years to do 2 things. First off is to get the South Vietnamese who fought during the war or who served during the war to tell their story, to correct that historical misinterpretation. To me, that is more important than anything. And the second part of it is I have tried to do that, but through my books and trying to understand the South Vietnamese side and to tell it so that historians and the American people will see a different side of the South Vietnamese people. And hopefully I've done some of that, but ultimately it comes down to the South Vietnamese people telling their story, to write down what happened to them. Even, as I say many times, even if you were just a sergeant in the motor pool, it's important to capture these stories before it's too late.
Yes, I understand that, but back to that same thing. When we say loser pirate, a lot of Vietnamese didn't want to talk about it.
Right.
It's their past. They don't even want to talk about it to their children.
Right.
And maybe they don't want to remember it. It's been thousands of years that the Vietnamese view history that way.
Yes, you're right.
The winners writing history, but now probably one of the first time they have their own voice. And if you were to look at the history, I think in your book you cover from the very beginning until almost the very end. So let's traverse that. I know we don't have enough time, but let's start with the 30s.
Right.
One of the journalists I knew, one of the very influential one, was having a view when the French got out of the country. They have different factions. They have the Cao Dai sect, the Hoa Hao sect, and the Binh Xuyên sect. One of the first effort of President CHIêm is trying to nationalize all these and put them into the same army. And he said that might not be the right thing. Do you think so? Because what he's saying is the different factions at the different part of the country, even though they don't unite, but they understand the people. They have their own army. They are somewhat self-regulated. And they're the best thing against the communists. What's your take on
Well,
that?
I think what President Diem was trying to accomplish was to unify the country under one government. The French had built up the Cao Dai and the Wa'ao as divide and conquer to keep the Vietnamese weak so they could control them. Whereas President Diem wanted to unify the country to fight the communists. And you can't do that if you have competing centers of power. And there's nothing more competing than a military, right? So both President Diem less than President Thieu. President Thieu wanted to give them a political voice, but not a military voice. And I think that was the correct way to go.
So you don't think that the hypothesis that leaving them alone, as we say warlord in a different part, because they know in their part and they know the people, and they know the custom, the tradition, and communists there's no way for the communists to infiltrate.
Well, if you look at that, the Wa'ao drove the communists out. They're probably the most pacified provinces in the country, whereas the Cao Dai had a tendency to be a little bit more neutral because they were in Taining. And they didn't want to be, they had to be very careful. So I think that the Wa'ao, and part of that was geography, were relatively left alone, whereas the Cao Dai were never as powerful as you want to say. They were more of a, hard to say. But I think President Thieu's efforts to bring them in, yet give them a voice, and let them have their own internal affairs was relatively a smart move.
Okay, so you agree that was the first move that President Diem made was the right move.
Yes.
You believe that all the factions should unite in
Yes.
order to have a stronger voice, regardless of, because the reason I ask this because a lot of Cao Dai leader and a lot of Hoa leader didn't want to be integrated into the national army. They said they'll lose their voice, they'll lose their power, and they don't have the flexibility it calls for when there's a crisis in their
Well, yes, that's the key statement, is that they were losing their power. They didn't want to lose their own power, whereas, you were going to have a very difficult time governing the country and creating national government if you don't, look at our own country, We can't give the Southern people a separate voice. We can't give the Western people. We have to have a unified country. So, but that's just my opinion.
Okay. Now that the President Diem, with the support of the Americans, already got the integrated army, he seems to have the best chance. He's French educated. He was in America for a long time. He had personal integrity, the dignity, and he's basically the personification of the South. He had 1 million refugees coming from the North that he settled. And then he have different factions that he integrated into the army. He got the Constitution now. He got the national referendum for the people. Seems to be the best man for the country.
Yes, but you have to understand that he may have had a constitution, but he and his brother were running the country without any checks and balances. The beauty of the American Constitution is that the executive branch, the president, is not all powerful. In fact, constitutionally, the president is relatively weak. The legislature, Congress, has most of the power. Then you have another branch, judiciary, whereas President Diem, the Constitution, the legislation had no power, and the judiciary had even less power. So he was running the country by himself. And that did not allow other political voices to be heard and to be a part of the country.
But you can also look at the other direction, because take a look at South Korea, take a look at Taiwan, where you have Chiang Kai-shek, and in Korea you have Park Chung-hee, and they do have the same problem,
Yes.
relatively the same problem with Vietnam. And they were successful. And even Singapore with Lee Kuan Yew is the same thing. And one might argue that, yes, the constitution is there, but they still pretty much, behind there is the power there. But it's understandable for a country at war.
You have asked the great question. What is the proper form of government when you are trying to build a country and trying to build a country at war? And this is the great question, because is it better to try to have a top-down system, or is it better to try to build from the bottom up? And this question is difficult to answer because there is cultural issues, there is development issues, and so both South Korea, Taiwan were destroyed. There were countries that were trying to build, and so initially, yes, it seemed like they built themselves up very quickly using this top-down model. But at what point in time do you have to switch from the top-down authoritarian model to a democratic model? And will the people who are in charge of the authoritarian model allow that switch? And so that was the question that was always never answered. And does that make sense?
Yes.
Cảm ơn quý vị vẫn giữ màn hình. Để tiếp tục, Thanh Trang kính mời quý vị theo dõi phần 2 phỏng vấn đặc biệt với sử gia Veith do Phan Dũng thực hiện.
A lot of Vietnamese weren't satisfied with that answer because they still think, like I said, the personification of the South was in CHIêm, the dignity was there, the prestige, and compared to any other nationalist, he seems to be the best out there. Politically, he looks good, and one always remember the image of President Eisenhower waiting for him at the airport hours long before welcoming him. So you could not deny that. And then the North, even the communists was writing letter trying to communicate to him and recognize him as the South. So a lot of Vietnamese thinking like the assassination of President CHIêm was definitely a deadly move for the Vietnamese.
Well, yes, but when you say many Vietnamese, you always have to remember that there was a smaller educated class in the cities, and then the vast majority of the population were people in the countryside. And so what happened was, how do you get the people in the countryside to understand and take control of their own destiny, right? And so I think this is where President Thieu differed very much from President CHIêm, was that he was trying to build the countryside. He was trying to create a society where the farmers and the local people controlled them. They owned their own land, they controlled their own destiny, they could build their own businesses, they could vote for whomever they want. And so he was trying to free this people, whereas people in the cities who are educated may have had this view, well, it's best for us to tell them what to do.
Yes, but one also can argue from the other point of view, because Vietnam was an evolving country from feudalism into, and then just a transition period.
Yes, well, see, that's my point, is that when is the transition period over? When will the people at the top give up power?
And it's also the question of the American intervention, is that should they intervene the John Paul Van way, or should they do it the Westmoreland way?
Right.
You know, the John Paul Van is always saying, in war we have to kill, but it's best with a knife.
Right, yes, yeah.
And if not, then a gun. Never the artillery. And yet Westmoreland was completely for the other side. And then the intervention at that point was my asking, if we were to preserve, well, this is a big what if question when you talk history. What if we preserve President CHIêm and we just use John Paul way of guerrilla fighting, you know, killing with a knife, and make sure whom you want to kill and you get rid of that problem?
Well, it's easy to sit here 60 years later and try to make President CHIêm look a certain way. But you have to remember that when the coup happened, there was thousands of people celebrating in the streets. you know, in Saigon, in Hue, and other places. And there was massive demonstrations against him. And you have to remember that there was heavy secret police, there was no freedom of the press, there was no allowance of other political parties. He was very much a man of controlling everything. Yes, there is some significant cultural differences between trying to take a country that had never known democracy, never even understood it, and try to put it into there immediately. Your other question about the John Paul Van versus Westmoreland, yes, I think that that Westmoreland's attempt to introduce regular American combat units was a mistake, but it was also a necessity, because fighting guerrillas is different than fighting a regular army. And the regular communist army from the north was coming in, and they had artillery, and they had heavy machine guns. So it's hard to fight a guy with a machine gun with a knife.
That's very true, but one would also argue that when the North have the conventional attack, it was only because the American get into the South that they decided to do that, because it was before the American intervention. It was just at the guerrilla level, which I think John Paul Van is.
That's by 1963, the guerrillas were now big battalions armed with weapons from the North too. They had regular army officers coming down to the South to help build these units. They were shipping in weapons from the North. So those guerrillas were now becoming battalions also. And some of the biggest battles of the war were happening right after the coup because of these changes in the guerrillas.
So you think the coup in a way is a conclusive blow to the Republic? Or without the coup, for example, if the administration was to last for like 5 more years, would that make a big difference?
You know, I have to remind everyone that the coup was not the Americans' idea. It was the idea of the generals, General Min, Tran Van Don, Le Van Kim, those people. They came to the Americans and said, hey, we want to do this. And they're like, okay. But we did not go to them. They came to us. So, and they had the coup because they thought that they were losing the war because of President Ziem's policies and because of his rule. And that the people were now going to the communist side. And if they did not act, the war, they would lose, South Vietnam would lose the war.
Yeah, but the main trigger would still have to be the American decision. If the Americans say no, you know, it will be off if you guys did that.
Yes, but you know, again, this is always an argument, and you have to be very careful reading the historical records. The Americans did not say yes, but they did not say no either, okay? So we say they gave them a green light to do it, right? But people have to remember it was still the South Vietnamese generals' decision to do this because they thought they were losing the war because of President Diem.
Very true. But see, when the Americans chose to support President Diem, they did it for all the right reasons. And now they give the green light that he's no longer. So is that something?
I don't know
if you support somebody in the beginning, giving them the resources, all the university students, I mean, you know, professors are coming there from Michigan University, building up the army, building up the political side, economically, whatever, and then right now you give a green light that it no longer works. Do you see something? And it would be really hard to say that they did not support the general. If you were saying that they weren't supporting, that is the Vietnamese, it's very hard to agree with that, I would say.
We're going into an area that's increasingly uncomfortable for me. I don't know what you want to say. I mean, you know, we can argue about the historical record for hours, you know.
That's very right. I'm just giving you what the Vietnamese are thinking. Most of my questions are coming from the Vietnamese side.
Okay.
You know, I've been reading books and everything, but the Vietnamese always have their so-called conspiracy theory or whatever you want. It's also in the United States, but these are really the things that whenever we talk about it, it's just like getting to the same point.
Right.
Another time we sit down and finally it's still coming to the same point. The first republic fall, it was American. That's what their conclusion. What you were saying is the Vietnamese does have an active part, but the Vietnamese themselves don't believe that they have any active part at all, and they just...
Well, that's completely wrong, and that's I guess that's a cultural thing and looking at it from different point of view. But if you look at all the American documents, it's always they came to us, sort of thing. And so I can't. It's hard for me to justify anything that happened all those years ago, but the broader issue of thinking that they have no influence, that always the Americans are controlling things behind the scenes, is the worst belief that the South Vietnamese have, because the Americans were always trying to help, and it was impossible. It's impossible for any people to control someone else.
Thanh Trang kính chào quý vị. Hôm nay thứ Bảy ngày 30 tháng 4 2022, đến với VATV hôm nay gồm phỏng vấn đặc biệt và quẳng gánh lo đi. Kính thưa quý vị, 30 tháng 4 là một trong những ngày lịch sử, một ngày đặc biệt và cũng là một ngày đau buồn nhất đối với những người Việt tị nạn. Hồi tưởng lại những sự việc đã xảy ra tại miền Nam Việt Nam, chúng tôi mời quý vị theo dõi những nhận xét và so sánh của sử gia Veith về hai vị tổng thống Việt Nam Cộng Hòa, Ngô Đình Diệm và Nguyễn Văn Thiệu, để đối chiếu với những cái nhìn lầm lạc của giới ký giả, truyền thông ngoại quốc về chiến tranh Việt Nam. Xin mời quý vị theo dõi phần 3 của phỏng vấn đặc biệt với sử gia Veith do Phan Dũng thực hiện.
Now look in another direction. If you were to see when the French left, the legacy of Vietnam is all French. And then are the Vietnamese leader really bastard of the French and the Vietnamese? I mean, in a way, like President Thiệu, President CHIêm, all of the Vietnamese officials they have French education,
yes.
and they were so-called trained in order to serve the French. Do you think that's the right?
Not trained to serve the French, but they were trained in French military schools. And the French military philosophy is, again, very much this top-down, centrally controlled, whereas the American military philosophy is the exact opposite. It's, again, we believe in the American military of giving our sergeants as much power as possible, to put as much power as low as possible, to make them responsible for the actions and not just sit and wait for orders. And that was always, again, this culture clash, because if you look at sort of South Vietnamese culture, again, it's a very hierarchical culture. You name your children, 2, 3, 4, 5,
Right.
But so Americans look at that as more like we have to, we call it to create the initiative or seize the initiative at the lowest level.
I think that's what you see from the military point of view. But what I'm asking was probably from the political point of view. When I say bastard, that's the term that the North,
right,
Northern communists use against the leader. They are lackeys.
Right.
They are all
puppets.
bastard because they're not purely Vietnamese. They got educated by the French and they work for the French as underling, and now the American came in as lackeys. So they are never on the equal footing with these guys in terms of cooperation with the French, or either French or American.
Right.
They are just basically bastard. And
Well, they call them puppets.
yeah, and they should be removed from power. Is that correct somehow? That's it.
No, I mean, you could say the same thing about the Northern Communists. They were trained by the Chinese and the Soviets, so you could say the same thing about them.
Very right, and I think your point comes to the one of the later book by Max Hastings. I remember a part in there. They say some William Bundy was saying Thiệu and Key was absolute bottom of the barrel.
Right.
So the Americans are also looking that way. Is William Bundy?
No, I think the Americans, almost every American document that talks about or analyzes Thieu, thought that he was probably the best of them. He was a smart man, very hardworking. Key was very emotional, had a tendency to, we would say, like we say in English, gaffe prone, you know. I mean, he always say things like he was just not thinking and just say things and would cause big problems. Whereas Thieu was more a man who was sort of kept his own counsel. I mean, I always say this, if you look at any leader, any president, or any human, you, me, or anybody, if we do 10 things in a day, we're going to get 6, 7 right, we're going to get 3 or 4 wrong. But the mistakes of the leader are amplified because they are the leader. You know, and the personality traits are amplified because they are the leader. But I think most Americans viewed President Thieu as sort of the best of the politicians of the time.
So we looked at the Second Republic. You looking at the President Thieu, like the way, how in your book you compare a lot, I think, with Giong Văn Minh, the contrast between the two.
Yes.
You think Giong Văn Minh would be a better one?
No, I thought he was a man who was easily influenced by other people. He did not have any original ideas of his own. In other words, he could not create policy. He could not say, we're going to have a land of the tiller. We're going to have this or this or this. And Thieu in many ways didn't either, but Thieu was smart enough to pick the people who did. So I think that Minh would have been a disaster because he was not a man of conviction. He did not have any good thoughts about or policies. He just went with whatever he said, people said, and whereas I think Thieu had an idea and he had plans.
Do you think another person, maybe Dr. Phan for example, a less military person, I'm talking about civil government, right. Would it be possible for civil government to go on at that point? Like so many nationalists would say at one of the point that we don't have democracy because we have a military guy.
Exactly. And I think that's the great tragedy for South Vietnam. We always talk about what ifs, is that if the communists had not killed Professor Nguyen Van Bong and he had replaced Prime Minister Kim, then you would have had the beginning of a civilian government, a different view, not only for the Vietnamese people, but for the outside world looking at South Vietnam. They would not have seen the government as a dictatorship or military government, because now you start to have civilians in charge. And I think ultimately that was the great problem to create worldwide support for South Vietnam, was that you had, even though you had a constitution, you had elections, it was still looked at as a military government.
Well, that comes to the media.
Right.
The way they portray it, not necessarily correct, but what they see at the time was, I don't want to blame any journalists, but most of the things they see are wrong.
Well, not that they see wrong, but they wrote it wrong. They didn't speak the language. They rarely went outside into the countryside. They often had information from other people who were trying to, I'm going to say it, run down the government. So, and they were liberal. It was, a time of change in America and stuff. So to be out there supporting a military government made you seem like on the wrong side.
Are you talking about the First Republic or the Second Republic?
Second Republic, yes. Oh, both republics. Both republics, actually.
So the journalists have a very dark view of the Vietnam as a country, South Vietnam as a country. And on the other hand, they don't know anything about the North because they
Never been there, yes. Yeah.
So would you say it would be better if none of them were existed? It would have done both of the republic a lot better.
It would have been impossible to keep. Well, the South Vietnamese government could have said all you journalists gone, but that would have made things worse. You know, now they were like, oh, you're suppressing freedom of speech. You know, so it's
catch-22. Sure,
exactly, that's precisely correct. A catch-22, yes.
So you don't think a lot of Vietnamese blame the journalists as well. Like my uncle, for example, he was a journalist, and he said, "I hate David Oberstam. I hate New Xi'an.
Right.
They look down on the Vietnamese.
Yes.
They don't understand what the hell they're talking about."
That's very true.
And I think my uncle is have a very typical view of the Vietnamese journalists, I would say.
But on the other side, I think that one of the great mistakes was the inability of the South Vietnamese to explain themselves to the world.
Well, you've already mentioned that in your book, and I don't know how justifiable is that, because for a typical Vietnamese, with all the problems in their own country and with not enough knowledge around the world to advertise themselves, so that that would be an impossible job.
Well, they should have. What I'm saying is trying to explain. We are trying to build a country. We're trying to build a democracy, and at the same time, this totalitarian government from the north is trying to conquer us. And somehow that message never was spoken enough, or talked about enough, or explained enough to make everyone else understand it.
We basically don't have a spokesman.
That is very correct. That's a good way to put it, yes.
We're not fluent in the language. We don't understand the culture. Neither do we have the time to. We never have the education. How do you expect we do that?
I'm saying to try. I'm not blaming you. I'm saying it should have been a greater effort.
Yeah, I remember that you wrote in the book, and I was asking myself, are you asking the guy, the guy without any dime, to go into a restaurant and buy a good meal and get a good seat on the restaurant? It was just impossible.
Your point is well made.
Thanh Trang kính chào quý vị. Hôm nay Chủ nhật ngày 1 tháng 5 2022. Kính thưa quý vị, qua lời nhận định cá nhân của sử gia Veith trong phần 3, thì gần như tất cả các tài liệu viết phân tích về Tổng thống Nguyễn Văn Thiệu đều viết rằng ông có lẽ là nhân vật xuất sắc nhất trong số những lãnh đạo tại miền Nam Việt Nam. Và đa số người Mỹ đều cho rằng ông Thiệu là một chính khách xuất sắc nhất trong giai đoạn ông cầm quyền. Mời quý vị tiếp tục theo dõi những nhận xét của sử gia Veith về những nhân vật chính trị trong thời đệ nhị Cộng Hòa qua những sự việc xảy ra tại miền Nam Việt Nam vào lúc đó. Mời quý vị theo dõi phần 4 phỏng vấn đặc biệt với sử gia Veith do Phan Lê Dũng thực hiện sau đây.
Let's come back to 1970s. When the Americans already in Vietnam. You're talking about Second Republic right now. And you have President Thiệu, like you said, he knew how to use men. He has a vision. He had worked with the Viet Minh before. So he was a cadre, as you mentioned in your book. A lot of these things I learned from the book.
Okay.
I never had any chance to talk to President Thiệu. And then reading about him in the Western media was like, bottom of the barrel. And that's the image I had before about him. And I said, wow, if the president was like that, then we deserve to lose. We were pirates. That was my conclusion at one point. Well, your book kind of changed that. So I said, now he put the man in the right position, like you said. He gave Phạm Kim Ngọc, for example, the economist, all of the power to build up the economy. Said, let me do the fighting. You do the economy. Same thing with Calvin Tan. Land to the tiller.
Exactly.
You do. And he did beautifully in both of these fields.
Yes.
Militarily, he also tried to get the military away from trying to get the democratic. Like you said, he's one of the best. So why did we fail with one of the best that you could ask for?
Why did we fail? That's I thought you were going to ask me about 1970.
Well, I mean, from then on.
Yeah, so you're right that Calvin Tan designed and led the Land of the Tiller program, and he was a Southerner. Phan Kim Ngọc built and designed the economy. And those two men, I think, did more for South Vietnam than any other person, because they unleashed South Vietnam's potential. You know, they gave the people in the countryside the ability to build their lives. They were not anymore having to pay rent. They had all this new ability to sell their goods, to build their lives. And you could see a dramatic change in the countryside in a very short time. Even though South Vietnam never became a rice exporter again, because there was a lot of different things, but they were getting there, you know. And the countryside was becoming, and I've had several people tell me that the farmers were making more money selling rice crops than President Thieu as a salary. So these two men, Pham Kim Nop, Cao Van Tan, I think are the true heroes of South Vietnam.
Okay, back to the 68.
Okay.
In 68, you have a Tet Offensive.
Mm-hmm.
Militarily, the North was completely, a failure in that. And yet, the American doesn't see that as such.
Because, there's two parts you have to remember about this, is that the Northerners attacked the cities because they thought, just like Putin thought Ukraine would fall easily, they thought that the South Vietnamese would collapse. And this goes back to my point about democracy versus top-down. You've had 4 elections by this time. You have a popularly elected president, a elected Congress, you have a constitution, and the South Vietnamese people, when faced with this massive attack, did not collapse. They fought back. They fought for their country. And to me, that is the greatest indication of why democracy and this bottom-up as opposed to top-down is better than the top-down. Because now the people are invested in their government and in their country, and they have a reason to fight. Okay? And I think the same reason why you're seeing the Ukrainians fight the Russians is that they are invested in their country. And if there's ever to me a key point, that is what it is.
Okay. One could also see from the other direction. If the people did not support the Viet Cong, they couldn't have made that large throughout the whole country from every provinces. So people at least not wholeheartedly supported the government the way you see.
I think it was less about supporting them as opposed to just not helping them. Just like turning a blind eye. You know, they see a column of VC heading, they just let them go. They don't do anything. 4 years later, 3-4 years later, then they would have fought. And it's the same thing with the second greatest thing that Thieu did was the People's Self-Defense Force. You are physically giving a weapon to a person in the village to help defend himself. That is turning power over to people at the village level, at the hamlet level, and giving them weapons and them not turning them on, not turning against the government, and not giving the weapons to the VC, not joining the VC, is the other great indicator that the people became invested in their government and in their country.
What we are seeing right now is looking back like 50, 60 years ago. But at that time, do you think the government really see that? The government must have seen what we were talking about.
President Thieu is the one that pushed the People's Self.
No, I'm not talking about the president. I'm talking about the American government. President Lyndon Johnson.
Johnson was gone by the time this happened.
Yeah, Nixon.
I don't think Nixon had any great view of the People's Self-Defense Force. At that point, he was all in favor of, that's what Vietnamization was turning over the military defense of South Vietnam to the South Vietnam people. So in that sense, yes, giving weapons to the people to defend themselves was a good thing.
Yeah, back to 1968 again. President Johnson was, the other large event in 1968 was the announcement from President Johnson not to run for president.
Yes.
What do you think he did? That's a damage to himself, damage to the American, and damage to the Vietnamese at the same time. And I think President Eisenhower say, it's such a contemptible act.
I don't have an answer for you on that one. Sorry, can't answer that one. Don't know.
So now, I think the Vietnamese had enough problem of their own. Mm-hmm. But then the American was never helping in seeing exactly what they were doing. The Lyndon Johnson did not see exactly the accomplishment that you talk about. President Nixon did not see exactly what the Vietnamese was fighting for. So we weren't helping them in any way. And
well,
I think
that's not true at all. Who do you think was paying for the economy and the land? It's not just the military part that we were supporting. It's the financial part. South Vietnam did not have a tax structure that could support its budget. In fact, that's what Nop was trying to accomplish. He was trying to wean South Vietnam off of American aid, because ultimately that was what's causing the South Vietnamese budget could not support its own military. And if you can't support then the military had to be built up to replace the Americans and the South Koreans and everybody else who was leaving. To do that requires money. And the only so you have two ways to get the money. Either you print the money, which causes inflation, which makes it even worse, or you get the money from someone else. And so we are the ones that were giving them the money to support the military. So as the Americans withdrew the military, we had to increase financial support. And that's what was keeping the South Vietnamese government and military afloat.
Yeah, for a while.
For a while. But once we started to withdraw and pull the money out, that's when it really became a problem.
Do you think it's the right thing the right point to pull out financial aid like that? Military is understandable, but the amount for supporting the Vietnamese is not that large of a budget.
Foreign aid is always a very difficult problem because the Congress has to vote for it. And by 72, 73, 74, Congress was becoming increasingly anti-war, anti-South Vietnam, and so it was becoming increasingly difficult to gain the votes to give the money to South Vietnam.
Cảm ơn quý vị vẫn giữ màn hình. Để tiếp tục chương trình, Thanh Trang kính mời quý vị theo dõi phần 5 và cũng là phần cuối của phỏng vấn đặc biệt với sử gia George Veith do Phan Dũng thực hiện sau đây. Để hiểu thêm những toan tính riêng của Trung Cộng, một đồng minh thân cận của Bắc Việt đã tặng cho Bắc Việt 16 chữ vàng: láng giềng hữu nghị, hợp tác toàn diện, ổn định lâu dài, hướng tới tương lai.
So was it actually the American failure? Looking from that, because the American people or American leader could not convince themselves that the South Vietnam was worth it?
Well, that's part of it, but you also have to remember something. South Vietnam was just one issue for America. We are a global power, right? We had Western Europe, we had Asia, we had Korea, we had all these other places around the world. South Vietnam was just one part of what America had to concentrate on or focus on. Mm-hmm. Not only worldwide, but its own internal, So is that why you name your book John the Woods? It was designed to remind Americans that this was a war in a foreign land, yes, but it was still part of ours, part of what we were doing.
So you're starting out with seeing through the glass darkly in Corinthians, as you quote the Bible.
Oh, yes.
And then you end it with drawn swords,
yes.
Also Leviticus,
yes.
From the Bible.
It was designed to remind everybody that that there are decisions have consequences, and so I have had South Vietnamese people, you should never have come. Well, if we have never come, you'd have been communist by 54. So anyways, these are all very difficult questions to answer.
Okay, Jay, I think for one book, especially your book, probably take us a year to discuss, because each part or each chapter of the book, there's a lot of issues that I never mentioned, because we simply don't have enough time. You're talking about factionalism between the people, you get religious fracture, you get all the things that you think, but final overriding factor come back again. If a high school student come to ask you, why did we lose in Vietnam, what's your answer? Take a look at both of the republic. You got the best man for the first republic, you got the best man for the second republic, best man at the best two historical time, and yet you lost both of it.
I think that South Vietnam was a very difficult country to militarily defend. And because the North could keep the pressure up, and South Vietnam was in the defensive positions, ultimately it was just too difficult to defend against an outside invader who was determined to conquer the country no matter how many losses they took. But I think that if we had managed to hang on for 5 more years, I think that there would have been a new generation of leadership, the economy would have righted itself, and I think that South Vietnam would have been doing a better job of being able to defend itself. There was a new generation of leadership, military leadership and civilian leadership that was right at the edge of taking over.
And it's unfortunate that we did not see that.
Yeah, exactly.
That brings us back to the final chapter. You're talking about Van Nuxam's plan. And Nguyễn Xuân Phong and all that mission that carried with him that nobody ever heard of, about the Chinese trying to support the South Vietnamese. Tell us more about that.
Well, I heard this story many years ago, and I have had many people tell me yes. So basically what happened was the Chinese were trying to prevent a unified Vietnam under communist control that was allied with Russia. And now you would have the Russians on their northern border and a hostile Vietnam on their southern border, and they're surrounded. So they're trying to prevent this. So what they were saying is, we want a neutral South Vietnam, right, under the NLF, the communists, and we will support them, and that way there's not a hostile Vietnam on our southern borders. And so they were offering to support, not two, well, somewhat of two, but more of a neutralized South Vietnam under General Minh that would be not aligned with the Americans, but not aligned with North Vietnam either. And they offered to support this, and they even offered at the very end to put in troops to support this. And this plan didn't come up until the very end.
Do you think it's unwise of Minh not to accept that?
It was too late at that point. By the time he got there and heard the plan, it was the North Vietnamese troops were already entering the city. It was too late.
So, understanding your book from the beginning until the end, for a student, what do you expect from him? What do you expect the book to do to him?
I think it's ultimately a lesson on how to try and build a country at war, and the successes and failures, what worked and what didn't work. And so I hope that people will read the book and understand not so much to blame the Americans or blame the South Vietnamese, but to see what worked and what didn't work. And so if other countries try to do this, they can look at this as a sort of a blueprint, if you will, of how to do things the best way.
Well, that's how history is supposed to be. You always look in the past.
Supposed to learn from history, yes.
You expect to learn a lot from it and revisit it. But for us Vietnamese, it's very painful to go back and look at it, and it's a philosophy inside to see it from the Vietnamese point of view. At least for my generation, or at least for me personally, at least reading all the American books before provided the American view. But reading your book is surprisingly giving a Vietnamese view.
I tried to capture the South Vietnamese voice.
We weren't that bad. And
you were actually pretty good.
We lost, but it was a good match. It was a good game. And we have nothing to be ashamed of. Seems to be.
That's exactly correct. And that's why I said at the very beginning, I was trying to show the South Vietnamese from their perspective, to show all the good things that they did. Because if you're going to talk about the bad things, You have to be balanced. You have to say both sides of the equation, right? So that is what I tried to accomplish, to tell the South Vietnamese story the best I could.
Thank you very much. And if you look back at the book right now, if you were to rewrite it, if you modify, you expand on some part, or is there anything that you plan to do?
I don't think there's anything I would change.
So you're pretty much very satisfied.
I'm satisfied. Yeah, I think I did the best. It's a huge book, so you can only tell the
It wasn't
story
that huge to me. I tried to enjoy it, but it wasn't that huge to me.
Yeah.
Anything in the future that would modify that book, or you pretty much leave it for the way it is for some time?
I would like to get more documents from the South Vietnamese archives, but that's a much more difficult thing.
Okay, Jay. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.